Hello, my name is Dr. Sylvea Hollis, and from September of 2018 until July of 2020, I was the NPS Mellon Post-Doctoral Fellow in Gender and Sexuality. I'm currently, as of August 2020, starting a position with Montgomery College as a position of African American History Assistant Professor in their Department of History and Political Science. It is a deep honor to be able to think about the commemoration of the centennial of the 19th Amendment with you all. And what it makes me first think of, perhaps most significantly from the space of Seneca Falls, is the very crucial work that the question of the vote for what meant for women. The vote for what? For what purpose did women first mobilize and seek rights for their own personhood? And I'm very passionate and inspired by the idea that women of the level of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and her compatriots, their first space of organizing was for their right to have a voice in abolitionist spaces. We understand wholly that by the era of emancipation, the political will of those women was tied far more for the rights to vote for the right to vote sake. And yet I think that oftentimes what's lost in the early memory of that women's rights movement has been the quintessential role of how women first wanted to mobilize for their right to speak in public spaces in the vein of abolition. That is the reason why one of the most revered and honored and respected public speakers of the 19th century was present on that day, Frederick Douglass. He was there in the role of abolition. And I think that it's really important that, leaning on the work of a myriad of scholars who have helped us to understand the significance of that moment, it's really important that we don't forget that. And so when I think about the centennial, what I lean on the most is the question of the vote for what. That's the continuity that holds us from 1848 to 1920 to 2020. The question of women's right to vote, but for what cause, for what issue? And only we, individual women, can say what matters to us most. We get to decide what issues are the ones that we want to advocate on behalf of. And the legal change and recognition in the Constitution with the 19th Amendment is absolutely something to celebrate and to remember, be it a centennial later. But I also will be remiss not to think about and reflect on the arc of a personal story within the centennial, leaning perhaps most on, well, certainly not perhaps, leaning definitely on the memory of people like my grandmothers on both sides of my family. So my father's mother grew up in Alabama, in Jefferson County, area now incorporated as a part of the city of Birmingham. And she was a domestic. And in her work as being a domestic, I assumed that she had very to little no political rights before the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965. Well, when she passed away and family members saw for the first time an extended opportunity to see what was inside of her cedar chest of memories, culling through those papers of records between the leaflets of pages in the family Bible that had our family history, culling between old children's progress reports, report cards, and noodle art, was a handful of poll tax receipts And so it wasn't until my grandmother passed away on my father's side that I discovered that she had been registered to vote and had been actualizing that right to vote as early as the 1940s. And she had done so throughout the rest of her life. I'm remiss to say that it was an overwhelming thing to learn at the late stage of my Ph.D. program that this woman, who, given the way that we understand how economically disadvantaged the labor that she was involved in was, had somehow been able to negotiate a right for herself to have a political voice in the Jim Crow South. And I deeply wish that I had had an opportunity to ask her, how did you get to vote at a period when so few African American women in the Deep South could? How did you get to register, which is something that we understand that a lot of people face things as she did, like poll taxes, but somehow she continued to pay her poll taxes. People face things before they even were able to register, like literacy tests, where they would go to a courthouse, and if the person that was the registrar of voting chose to ask that person to fill out a literacy test that asks very, very complicated questions about the Constitution. It's almost like a citizenship test. We know that there was a lot of people that had advanced degrees that walked into those courthouses that were allowed to take the test, but not allowed to pass the test. And so I wish that I had was an opportunity to have a conversation with my grandmother and have a better understanding of how she was able to pass a test that was supposed to be unpassable. And I don't say that as a way to say that she's exceptional. I say that as a way to highlight how complicated the access to the vote was for women in the South, for women who were African American in the South. And so as much as we celebrate the moment, it's also, we will be remiss, and it's necessary for us to recognize how complicated that moment was from the 1920s through the 1940s and well on to present day. The issue of the vote for what, the vote for whom, the vote how continues to reign as a conversation, and more so than a conversation, as a moment that people have to decide how they feel. My mother's mother was not a domestic. She was a homemaker who worked inside the home. Grandfather was a coal miner in Birmingham, and he worked a lot of other jobs so that his wife did not have to work outside of the home. And yet, that economic freedom that he secured did not grant the same type of political freedom, ironically, that my grandmother, who was a domestic, had. And so my grandmother did not, on my mother's side, was not able to register to vote until the 1965, when the Voting Rights Act passed. And yet when it passed, she registered and she volunteered to assist with voter education campaigns in the city through the Birmingham Civic League. And she went on to become a poll watcher and oversee polling stations well into her 90s, because the vote meant that much for her and access to the ballot meant that much to her. So two women with disparate experiences and access to the ballot. And I offer them to you, these stories, as a metaphor for why my parents, when I was a child, took so much time and care in taking me to the ballot, taking me to, at the time, through my very naive eyes, exuberantly passing me on stickers. And I voted today sticker. And I think often about the significance of those women's relationship to the ballot. And the 2 years that I spent in my postdoc, I spent a lot of time thinking about how to place the significance of the commemoration alongside the personal biographies. And I know people within MPS have been thinking about that on a local level with the various sites around the country that have really important conversations and relationships that they've been developing around the ballot. I want to close by saying the work is personal, and yet it's also rooted in a type of academic rigor. And so I will be remiss in, over the past couple years, to not acknowledge how deeply grateful I was for the people who created a whole body of scholarship to help me think through the significance of the centennial. The late Dr. Rosalind, who wrote about African American women's access to the ballot before the 19th Amendment in state by state or municipal elections or educational spaces, and after, and how the women who were not granted access in 1920 continue to mobilize. People like Dr. Lisa Matterson, who wrote about women in Chicago and Illinois, who may have migrated up, some of which migrated up from the Deep South, and voted in the 1870s on behalf of African American women who had not been able to vote earlier, and particularly in the 19-teens, like the Oscar de Priest election. And thinking of the work of Dr. Martha Jones, who also was writing a type of series of biographies around women's political access to the vote through the lens of African American history, and Dr. Lisa Ted, whose work focuses especially on the significance, memory, and role of Seneca Falls. I think that the thing that binds the way that I think of the scholarship the most is, or has been, the larger conversation of the question of the vote for what. And with those ideas, I offer to you a desire and a request that as we remember the very remarkable moment that created and codified, even if passively, access to the ballot through the language of the vote shall not be denied, that we all consider in this particular moment what the vote means for us personally and what it means for us in our relationship to each other.